Imagine standing on the deck of a ship, knowing that the ocean ahead wants to kill you. The horizon stretches endlessly, a violent gray-blue line that promises wealth beyond imagination or a watery grave. 150 men crowd the deck of a vessel called the Fancy, their eyes locked on the distance. Behind them, they've left a trail of destruction. Ahead of them, a treasure so massive that a single man's share would make him richer than 100 lifetimes of honest work. But here's the thing that makes this story different from every pirate tale you've heard: they weren't just risking the sea. They were sailing directly into the teeth of an empire. They were running from the most powerful naval forces on Earth. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that capture meant hanging. In the summer of 1695, a man named Henry Avery made a decision that would echo through the centuries. He looked at his crew, looked at the sea, and said, "We're doing this anyway. No turning back. No escape plan. Just pure, audacious ambition." What happened next wasn't just a robbery. It was a heist so massive that it triggered the first international manhunt in human history. Governments collided. Empires clashed. And one pirate became so legendary that historians still argue about whether he was even real. Today, we're diving into the story of a man who sailed into impossible odds and walked away with a treasure so vast that you couldn't carry it all in a modern cargo ship. This is the story of Henry Avery, the king of pirates. And trust me, it gets darker, more dangerous, and far more incredible than you could possibly imagine. Henry Avery wasn't born a pirate. In fact, he started out exactly how you'd expect a man to start out in the 1690s, as a servant to the crown. He joined the British Royal Navy as a young man, learned the language of the sea, the mechanics of navigation, and most importantly, how to lead men through absolute chaos. Years passed. Avery climbed the ranks, becoming a petty officer, witnessing battles during the 9 Years' War. He was competent, disciplined, dangerous. Everything a military man should be. But then something changed. The military life couldn't contain his ambition anymore. Avery left the Navy and entered the slave trade, working for the governor of the Bahamas. For years, he sailed the Guinea coast, moving enslaved people between ports. He became known as something far worse than a regular trader, a man who turned on other traders, hoisting friendly flags just to betray them. He learned that loyalty was a luxury, that deception was survival, and that power came to those willing to take it. These lessons would define everything that came next. In 1693, Avery was hired as first mate on an English expedition called the Spanish Expedition Shipping Voyage. The mission was straightforward: sail to La Coruña, Spain, then hunt French merchant vessels in the Caribbean for glory and gold. 4 warships were provisioned and ready. The crew was assembled. Everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. The ships arrived at La Coruña and promptly got stuck. Bureaucracy strangled the mission. Paperwork piled up. Naval officials delayed departure. Months crawled by. The crew sat idle, watching their dreams of adventure and fortune drain away. Worse than that, they weren't getting paid. Not a single coin. Frustration metastasized into anger, then into rage. By May 1694, the crew was ready to explode. Avery watched this powder keg carefully. He understood what desperation looked like. He'd seen it on the faces of enslaved people on the Guinea coast. He knew exactly how to use it. So when the moment came, he moved. Avery went to the other officers and crew members and did something radical. He asked them what they wanted. And he meant it. In a moment of pure democracy born from desperation, the crew voted. They didn't want to sit in La Coruña anymore. They didn't want to chase the goals of distant English commanders. They wanted to take the ship and sail somewhere that wealth actually existed. The vote was unanimous. Avery seized the Charles II, renamed it the Fancy, and became captain in a single afternoon of controlled chaos. For the first time in his life, he wasn't serving someone else's ambition. He was his own man. But freedom came with a price that nobody on that deck fully understood yet. They weren't just deserting the Navy now. They were declaring themselves enemies of the Crown, enemies of the East India Company, enemies of the civilized world. They had stepped over a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The Fancy left port with 150 desperate men, a captain with nothing left to lose, and a single unspoken agreement: find wealth or die trying. After the mutiny, Avery knew they couldn't simply sail around looking for merchant ships. They needed intelligence. They needed targets. More importantly, they needed to disappear before every naval warship in the Atlantic started hunting them. So Avery made a calculated decision: head south, then east, to the Indian Ocean. That's where the real money was. That's where the Mughal Empire's treasure fleets sailed annually, carrying riches so immense that a single ship could fund a nation. The Fancy's first act of piracy came at the Cape Verde Islands. 3 English merchant ships were traveling to Barbados, fat and slow and perfect. Avery's crew attacked with methodical precision, stealing supplies, wealth, and recruits. Some of the merchant sailors decided that piracy looked better than the merchant life. They joined the Fancy voluntarily. The ship was growing. The crew was becoming something harder, something more dangerous. Avery then sailed down the Guinea coast, territory he knew from his slave trading days. In the Bight of Benin, he made a strategic decision that would change everything. He had the Fancy razzied, essentially rebuilt to be sleeker and faster. This wasn't a small modification. This was a complete transformation. They stripped unnecessary weight from the hull, adjusted the rigging, refined every line of the ship. When they left the Bight, the Fancy wasn't just a warship anymore. It was the fastest vessel on the ocean. It was a predator built for speed. The ship continued its eastward journey, stopping at South Africa, Madagascar, and the Comoros Islands. With each stop, new crew members climbed aboard. Veterans of other pirate operations. Men running from the law. Men who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. By the time the Fancy arrived in the Comoros, Avery commanded 150 men, a floating army that grew more confident with each passing day. But confidence is dangerous at sea. It makes you careless. It makes you forget that there are forces far more powerful than you waiting in the deep water. Avery understood this. So while he was anchored in the Comoros, he did something unexpected. He sat down and wrote a letter to all the English ship captains working for the East India Company. In this letter, he swore that he'd never attacked English vessels and never would. It was a masterpiece of calculated deception. Avery wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was trying to negotiate a temporary truce by lying through his teeth. The letter worked, mostly. The East India Company captains didn't immediately mobilize to hunt him. But Avery knew it was temporary. Every day at sea was borrowed time. Every moment they existed was a moment the world's most powerful maritime force could locate them and destroy them. So Avery made a decision that was either genius or madness. Nobody's been able to decide which one. He would sail to the Red Sea and intercept the Mughal Emperor's treasure fleet. Not a merchant convoy. Not a random cargo ship. The actual treasure fleet of the Grand Mughal, Emperor Aurangzeb, one of the wealthiest men in human history. The Fancy, with its 150 men and its 46 cannons, was going to attack the most valuable ships on the ocean, defended by imperial warships and hundreds of trained soldiers. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly what Avery was going to do. In the summer of 1695, the Red Sea became Avery's hunting ground. The Fancy sailed slowly through these waters, every man watching the horizon with obsessive intensity. They were waiting for a specific target, a fleet of 25 massive Mughal ships, moving together like a caravan of whales. These ships carried textiles, spices, gemstones, and gold. Lots and lots of gold. The total value of cargo was equivalent to nearly $100 million in today's money. But it wasn't just about the treasure. It was about what capturing that treasure meant. It meant declaring war on the most powerful merchant empire in the world. It meant making yourself a target that would be hunted until you were captured or dead. Avery didn't care about consequences anymore. Consequences were abstractions. Consequences belonged to the future. Right now, in this moment, there was only the hunt. The Mughal fleet appeared in late August, massive ships moving together in defensive formation. But the Fancy wasn't alone. Avery had managed to unite his crew with other pirate vessels, including a ship called the Amity, captained by a legendary pirate named Thomas Tew. For the first time in this generation of piracy, multiple pirate ships were working in coordinated alliance. It was an unprecedented moment. These weren't random outlaws. These were organized raiders, synchronized, strategic, lethal. The Fancy's crew took their positions. Cannons were loaded. Cutlasses were sharpened. Muskets were primed. Every man knew what came next was either going to make them wealthy beyond imagining or kill them in the next few hours. There was no middle ground. There was no running away now. The flagship of the Mughal fleet was the Ganjai Sawai. Imagine this vessel for a moment: 400 soldiers on board, 80 cannons bristling from her sides, a massive cargo hold packed with treasure so valuable that a single chest could ransom a kingdom. This wasn't a merchant ship. This was a fortress that floated. This was the last line of defense protecting an empire's wealth. And Avery was going to attack it with ships that were faster but outgunned and outnumbered. On that late August night, the Fancy and the Amity moved toward the Ganjai Sawai like wolves circling a bear. At first, Avery's crew thought they might be crushed before they even made contact. The Ganjai Sawai's cannons roared to life. But here's where luck intervened in ways that changed history. One of the Fancy's cannons fired at exactly the right moment, hitting the Mughal flagship at exactly the right angle. The shot struck the Ganjai Sawai's main mast, sending it crashing down in a catastrophic domino effect of splintered wood and tangled rigging. The mighty warship, suddenly crippled and chaotic, lost its advantage instantly. Avery's men didn't hesitate. They surged forward, boarding the damaged vessel with the ferocity of men who understood they might never get another chance like this. What happened next would take 2 hours of close-quarters combat. Swords clashing. Muskets firing. Men dying on both sides. The deck of the Ganjai Sawai became a slaughterhouse, a violent chaos where individual skill and courage determined who lived and who died. Avery's crew, smaller in number but united by a singular purpose, pushed through the Imperial defenders yard by bloody yard. When the Ganjai Sawai finally fell into the hands of the pirates, something extraordinary happened. The fighting didn't stop. It transformed. What had been military combat became something far darker and more savage. The crew of the Fancy had spent months at sea, enduring hardship, fighting for survival, dreaming of the moment when all that sacrifice would pay off. Now they had that moment. And they lost control. Avery's men flooded into the ship like a tsunami of violence. They tore through the vessel searching for treasure, finding rooms filled with gold coins, silver bars, precious gemstones, pearls, and jewelry that seemed to have no end. But the treasure wasn't where the brutality stopped. It intensified. The pirate crew began torturing the Mughal crew members, particularly the men who'd fought them. They wanted information about hidden treasure, about secret compartments, about any additional wealth that might be stored somewhere on the massive ship. The torture went on for days. Men were beaten. Men were burned. Men were broken until they revealed everything they knew about where the wealth was hidden. And then the pirates turned their attention to the passengers, particularly the women on board. This is the part of the story that history often glosses over, but it's crucial to understand what actually happened during this raid. Contemporary historian Kafi Khan documented what occurred, after having remained engaged for a week, in searching for plunder, stripping the men of their clothes and dishonoring the old and young women. They left the ship and its passengers to their fate. Some of the women, getting an opportunity, threw themselves into the sea to save their honor. This was the reality of the golden age of piracy. It wasn't romance. It was brutality at its most naked. Avery himself was accused of attacking an elderly woman who was a relative of Emperor Aurangzeb himself. This wasn't a victimless crime. This was violence committed against vulnerable people by desperate men who'd suddenly acquired absolute power and no restraint. But from the perspective of the crew, what they were doing was liberating themselves. For years, they'd been controlled, by the Navy, by merchants, by society. Now they were free. Now they could take what they wanted without consequence. The fact that this freedom came at the expense of innocent people seemed irrelevant to men who'd been systematically dehumanized by a world that treated them as disposable. After an entire week of searching and plundering, the pirates finally loaded all the treasure they could carry into their ships and departed. The Ganjai Sawai, damaged and devastated, was left behind with its survivors to their fate. The flagship had been defeated. The treasure had been taken. The impossible had actually happened. The combined value of what Avery's fleet had seized was staggering. When broken down between crew members, even the lowest-ranking pirate received a share equivalent to thousands of dollars in modern currency. For men who'd never owned anything, this was transformative wealth. But wealth on the ocean meant nothing if you couldn't get it back to land. And now, with the most powerful maritime forces in the world hunting them, getting home alive became the real challenge. The moment Emperor Aurangzeb learned about the attack on the Ganjai Sawai, his rage became geopolitical. This wasn't just a robbery. This was an act of war. The most sacred treasure of the Mughal Empire had been stolen by European criminals. Aurangzeb didn't respond with negotiation or ransom demands. He seized control of the British East India Company's factories in India and demanded compensation. More importantly, he demanded justice. He demanded the heads of those responsible. The East India Company understood the severity immediately. If they didn't recapture Avery and his men, the profitable trade relationship they'd spent generations building would collapse. So they did something unprecedented in human history. They declared a truly international manhunt. Bounties were issued. Naval vessels were dispatched. Intelligence networks were activated. For the first time, multiple governments and corporations were cooperating to track down and eliminate a single pirate captain and his crew. Avery had become the enemy of all mankind, not just of one nation, but of everyone with power and wealth worth protecting. The Fancy sailed toward the Caribbean, specifically toward the Bahamas. Avery knew that if he could reach New Providence, there was a chance he could hide in a place where the local government was corrupt enough to be bought. Governor Nicholas Trott was exactly the kind of official that Avery could work with, a man whose loyalty could be purchased. So Avery made an offer: "Give us safe harbor and I'll give you the Fancy and a cut of the treasure." Trott accepted immediately. The Fancy was anchored in New Providence, and Avery's men began distributing the treasure and planning their escape. But the East India Company's reach extended further than Avery anticipated. Ships arrived in New Providence. Intelligence confirmed that the Fancy was hidden there. Before Avery and his crew could completely disperse, the hunters arrived. The crew scattered. Some men fled to the colonies. Others hid in the Caribbean islands. The East India Company captured 24 of Avery's original crew. 5 were executed, their bodies displayed as warnings to anyone who might consider following in Avery's footsteps. And then Henry Avery disappeared. Nobody knows exactly what happened to him. Some historians believe he fled to Ireland on a ship called the Sea Flower in 1696 and lived out his days in quiet anonymity. Others claim he made his way to Madagascar, where he helped establish a pirate republic. Some even suggest he returned to England and died in poverty after being cheated out of his treasure. In 2024, researchers discovered a coded letter in Scottish archives dated December 1700 and signed by Avery the Pirate. This letter suggests he may have been living in England and was possibly part of King William III intelligence network, working alongside figures like Daniel Defoe and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The truth is, nobody has definitively proven what happened. Avery became a ghost, a legend whispered about in taverns, a story retold so many times that people began to wonder if he'd ever been real at all. But he was real. And the mystery of his disappearance ensured that he'd be remembered forever. Henry Avery knew the sea would take him. He understood, standing on the deck of the Fancy in that summer of 1695, that the ocean was a graveyard and he was sailing directly into it. Every man on his crew knew it too. They'd seen ships go down. They'd seen men drown. They'd heard the stories about sailors who sailed into the Red Sea and never came back. But they sailed anyway. That's the essential truth of this story. It's not about the treasure, though the treasure was real and massive. It's not about the raid, though the raid was audacious and violent. It's about men who looked at impossible odds and decided to confront them anyway. Some of them died. Some of them were captured and executed. But Henry Avery escaped. He disappeared into history like a phantom, leaving behind nothing but questions and legends. The heist of the Ganges Sawai was the largest pirate raid in history. It was never repeated because it was never successfully replicated. The moment of vulnerability that allowed Avery to strike passed immediately after, and navies worldwide upgraded their defenses. It was a window that opened for exactly one moment in time, and Avery had the audacity to climb through it. What happened to Henry Avery remains the greatest maritime mystery in history. Did he live peacefully in Ireland? Did he establish a pirate kingdom in Madagascar? Did he work for the British government as a spy? The answer matters less than the question itself. What matters is that a man walked away from the greatest heist in pirate history, walked away from the most powerful manhunt ever organized, and simply vanished like smoke. He became immortal through disappearance, more legendary in absence than he could have ever been in presence. And that's why, 3 centuries later, we're still talking about him. That's why sailors still tell his story. Because Henry Avery understood something fundamental about human existence: sometimes you have to sail into the darkness knowing the sea might take you. Sometimes the only victory is in the defiance.